The mythical Pitcairn Island is so remote and its history so bizarre that, until recently, it was considered more of a myth than a reality. The few remaining inhabitants engaged in practices that defied social norms, including delinquency and much abuse, creating a community shrouded in mystery and controversy. Today, these inhabitants carry with them a dark and disturbing narrative, portrayed in films and books over time. If you want to unravel the macabre developments on this island, stay with us until the end, because the facts we're about to present are cruel and seem straight out of an almost apocalyptic scenario. But before we dive into this story, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a thing. Without further ado, let's get to the video. Approximately 2,000 kilometers from stunning Tahiti in French Polynesia lies the volcanic island of Pitcairn, inhabited by less than 50 brave residents. Here, electricity is a rare luxury, and the connection to New Zealand is made only 4 times a year by boat. In this isolated refuge, subsistence is guaranteed by growing fruit and vegetables and fishing for seafood in the surrounding crystal-clear waters. The houses, which are perfectly integrated with nature, don't need doors, and their facades are adorned with lush trees and plants. Surprisingly, there is even a school that caters for children up to the age of 12. But in 2021, it only had 3 pupils enrolled. The electricity is switched off from 10 at night until 6 in the morning to save diesel. Recently, Wi-Fi and cell phone access have been made available, but the residents have always communicated with each other and the outside world via VHF radio. Rare visitors who have the opportunity to explore this hidden gem are welcomed into the homes of local families, as the island has no resorts, hotels, restaurants, or bars. Despite limitations that may not meet the most demanding expectations, Pitcairn carries a fascinating history, being home to direct descendants of the infamous mutineers who, in 1789, took control of the British warship Bounty. It's a story that's anything but traditional, and that's why it deserves to be told. On December 23, 1787, the Bounty set sail from Great Britain under the command of Lieutenant William Bligh, an experienced sailor. The aim was to collect breadfruit on an island in the Pacific. This fruit, as tasty as a fig, was of interest to the British Crown as an economic solution for feeding slaves in the British West Indies. 46 men on board faced challenges from the start. After failing in their attempt to cross the dreaded Cape Horn on October 26, 1788, the Bounty finally anchored in Tahiti, where the crew was amazed. Tahiti was everything they had dreamed of and more. The British were warmly welcomed by the Tahitians, tasting delicious fruit and exchanging items with the locals. And guess what? The sailors quickly became involved with the island's charming women, exchanging sexual favors for valuable items such as nails and iron tools. Legend has it that on one occasion, the ship's lieutenant showed a native gold and silver coins, but what really fascinated the man was a simple iron nail. For the Tahitians, gold and silver had no value. Tools, on the other hand, were precious, because they facilitated the construction of boats and other necessities. And precisely for this reason, there was no prejudice against native women interacting with foreigners in exchange for these valuable artifacts. With the voyage delayed, the Bounty stayed in Tahiti for almost 6 months, waiting for the breadfruit plantations to be ready. Surprisingly, the sailors were happy about this. During the day, they picked breadfruit and tended the crops, and at night they indulged in parties and entertainment. However, the festivities came at a cost. More than 40% of the crew had to be treated for sexually transmitted diseases brought by British and French explorers years before. So the British began to adopt the Tahitian way of life, with tattoos, dancing, and everything else. But while the majority were getting carried away, Lieutenant Bligh, steady as a rock, resisted the temptations, determined to get his cargo to the British West Indies as quickly as possible. Known for being a strict disciplinarian, he didn't hesitate to intimidate his men and apply severe punishments for even the smallest faults. And the crew's lack of discipline began to bother him more and more, especially with the excessive freedom that even other officers, like First Mate Fletcher Christian, seemed to tolerate. Fletcher, a young man of 23 who came from a noble but completely bankrupt family, found himself caught between his lineage and the harsh reality of life on board the Bounty. He had a good relationship with Bligh, but that didn't make him immune to the tension that was building up. Leaving Tahiti wasn't easy for most of the sailors. With the return to command of a Bligh who was more authoritarian than ever, things became even more complicated. He started handing out severe punishments for any reason he deemed worthy, and seemed to take particular pleasure in picking on the officers who had taken advantage of the island's freedom, especially the young first mate. And so the situation only heated up. 3 weeks after leaving Tahiti, Bligh accused Fletcher of stealing coconuts from the stocks. That was the last straw. In the early hours of April 28, 1789, Fletcher and some sailors decided it was time to act and went on the rampage, tying up Bligh and changing the course of history. Chaos overtook the Bounty, and the crew soon split into two groups. On the one hand, those loyal to Bligh. On the other, those who decided to leave him behind. Riots are no joke in the Navy, but Fletcher Christian managed to win over followers. What made that happen? Well, mistreatment, physical punishment, and indifference on the part of the officers were part of everyday life on British Navy ships. Sailors endured this rigid discipline because desertion or mutiny could result in severe punishments, up to and including the gallows. So we can say that the punishments were not the real reason for the rebellion. To understand why they decided to take control of the ship, we need to look at the context of the time. In Britain, life for the underprivileged was a real struggle, with limited access to education and medical care, as well as constant hunger and a society dominated by the nobility. So when they arrived in the paradise of Tahiti, with its abundant fruit, pleasant climate, and the possibility of a peaceful life, the sailors saw a chance to escape this oppressive system. And of course, the charm of the island's beautiful and exotic women also weighed heavily on their decision to mutiny. And so it was that the captain and the 18 who decided to follow him were put on a boat, while young Christian and the rest of the crew returned to Tahiti aboard the Bounty in search of a new life. But the unlikely happened. It sounds like a lie, but against all expectations, William Bligh managed to sail his dinghy more than 4,000 miles until he was rescued and returned to England in April of 1790. As soon as he arrived, he reported what had happened, and the ship called HMS Pandora was sent to capture the mutineers and bring them back to face execution. Meanwhile, Fletcher Christian and 9 sailors who had rebelled, accompanied by 18 Polynesians, 6 men, 11 women, and 1 child, decided it was time to leave Tahiti and avoid capture. The majority of the crew, however, were so in love with life on the island that they didn't even think about fleeing. They simply wanted to stay there forever. And guess where the fugitives ended up? On remote Pitcairn Island. They arrived there on January 15th, 1790, and let's face it, that was a very wise choice. As soon as they landed, they burned the Bounty and sank it in Bounty Bay, ensuring that the wreckage was hidden. For the rest of the world, the rebels had simply disappeared, and no one bothered to look for them in Pitcairn. But those who decided to stay with the crew, they had it bad. The HMS Pandora arrived in Tahiti in March 1791. 3 of the mutineers surrendered without resistance, but the others, on learning that the military were nearby, fled into the mountains. Unfortunately, this didn't help, as they were captured in just 2 weeks. The 14 men who stayed behind were locked up in a makeshift cell known as Pandora's Box, with less than 4 meters of space. Surely many of them wondered if they wouldn't have done better to follow Fletcher, even if it meant going to the end of the world, as they were now trapped in a desperate situation. Those who decided to follow young Lieutenant Fletcher Christian settled on Pitcairn Island, where they initially survived by planting and fishing. It seemed like everything was going to be perfect, but it wasn't. Life in isolation soon revealed its pitfalls. The lack of a government and social rules soon gave way to jealousy, betrayal, and ultimately, murder. One of the main sources of tension on the island was the shortage of women. The British sailors divided the island among themselves, with each European taking a woman. But this led to conflicts, as only 3 Polynesian women were available for the other 6 men. The situation was about to explode, and indeed it did. 5 of the rebel sailors were killed by Polynesians, who accused the English of treating them like slaves and taking their women by force. One of the murders was particularly grotesque. A man's body was cut in half in a bizarre sacrificial ritual. In retaliation, the rioters did not hesitate to kill all the Polynesian men, burying some up to their necks on the beach so that the tide would drown them. After these horrible deaths, the violence stopped, but peace on the island was fragile, and various other conflicts arose between the men. By the year 1800, just a decade after arriving on the island, all the native Polynesians and the mutineers had died. Only John Adams remained, who, against all expectations, led the formation of a new peaceful society based on Puritan principles. He lived in Pitcairn until his death at the age of 65, being the only mutineer with an identified grave. But if you think that's the end of the story, you're mistaken. There were many more aberrations to come. In 1800, 2 British ships passing through the region anchored unexpectedly in Pitcairn Cove. It was there that they found the grave of John Adams and held a ceremony granting him amnesty for his part in the Bounty Mutiny. With the arrival of these new visitors, the island's population began to grow again. From 1825 onwards, trade routes began to be established, and Pitcairn became known as one of the most remote places in the world, a perfect place for those who wanted to disappear without a trace. In 1838, the British tried to colonize Pitcairn once again, creating a religious colony. Unfortunately, this first attempt was unsuccessful, largely due to disease and storms that devastated the colony. In 1886, a new wave of colonization arrived with the Seventh-day Adventists, and it seems that everything worked out this time. They brought hope and faith to the community, helping to heal the wounds left by the island's troubled past. Pitcairn remained a little visited place with few inhabitants, and at first glance everything seemed to be under control. But, as always, appearances can be deceiving, and something more was to come. In 2004, journalists went to the isolated island of Pitcairn and discovered a story as intriguing as it was shocking. The small community, famous for being home to the descendants of the HMS Bounty mutineers, hid a dark secret. For decades, horrific crimes had been committed against women and children. The women were locked in cells at night. They were not allowed to wear clothes and received physical punishment whenever they made a mistake in the eyes of the men. The men changed wives and kept a kind of harem, often made up of their own children. The most shocking thing is that everything happened in the open, without anyone even trying to hide it. Pitcairn was simply too far away for anyone to know what was going on or to care. Worse still, many of those people didn't understand their actions as criminal. The documentary makers were terrified and left with the footage that proved the horror. Once the authorities were alerted, they arrived on the island, freed the prisoners, and arrested the culprits. In a trial that lasted over a month, everyone was sentenced, including the mayor who had negotiated the arrival of the production team. All the accused, including the mayor, pleaded not guilty. They claimed that having sex with minors was a local custom and that there was no violence. One of the most shocking stories is that of a woman who was forced 4 times, the first when she was 11. According to her, when she came home from an attack and told her father what had happened, she was beaten up because she was going to be late for church. But unfortunately, as we said earlier, many of the victims considered the situation normal. According to a resident interviewed by the British newspaper Independent, the attacks may have arisen as a power struggle between the men on the island. This version points to the then mayor, Christian, who started a terrible practice based on a distorted belief. He considered himself entitled to initiate the girls of the community. This attitude would have aroused the envy of the other men, who began to follow the same pattern, seeking out younger and younger girls. These assaults continued repeatedly, often for years, and resulted in many women becoming pregnant. The women then ended up marrying their own abusers, creating a toxic cycle of abuse and submission. Today, Pitcairn bears the consequences of this dark history, and its small, aging population faces new dilemmas. With fewer and fewer people to carry out the arduous tasks of island life, the island's future remains uncertain. Only time will tell whether the community will be able to rebuild its history and face the challenges that tomorrow will surely bring. And so we end our journey through the intriguing Pitcairn Island. Have you heard of these dark stories? Tell us in the comments which part impressed you the most. If you're curious to discover more secrets and places that challenge everything you know, don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you don't miss the next videos. To those of you who have watched us so far, thank you very much, and we'll see you on our next adventure through this bello mundo, which is often not so beautiful.